Hi everybody. So this is the third part of our How to Do History series. And last time I talked about the different kinds of sources that historians use. We talked about primary sources and secondary sources mainly. Today I'm going to focus on primary sources and how to go about understanding bias and uncovering bias when you are looking at primary sources. So in order to do that, we first have to understand, well, what do we mean by bias? Determining the viewpoint or the bias of sources can be difficult. All of the sources that we will be reading this term have a particular viewpoint that they are expressing about something. And probably the most important thing to remember in all of these sources, indeed in every single source that you come across in this or in any other history course, is that all of them have a bias. So when it comes to bias in historical primary sources, we simply mean a tendency toward a particular feeling, inclination, or point of view. Now, often when people think about bias, they tend to think of this in very negative terms, as in, that news article was so biased, it's really unreliable. But when we're looking at primary sources in history, we have to erase that negative connotation from our minds. Bias in this case is simply a particular feeling, inclination, or point of view. So bias and viewpoint are very closely related. And all primary sources have some sort of bias because primary sources are created by human beings. And human beings have particular opinions and viewpoints that are shaped by their life experiences, by their gender, by their race, by their social class, their level of education, their political beliefs, their religious beliefs. We have to take all of these things into account. In the very simplest of terms, bias is whether a source is pro or anti something. Not all sources are going to be totally upfront with their bias. Some of them you encounter might seem pretty neutral on the surface, but if you look closely, you can see very subtle cues that indicate a bias in favor of or against something. And it's your job as a historian to figure out what that bias might be. And there's always a bias. So whenever anybody says to you in a history course, what's the bias here? 99% of the time, it's not going to be, oh, there's no bias. There's always a bias. So just take that as a given. Now, we also have to ask the question, well, does a bias make a source unreliable? And again, for the purposes of historical primary sources, the answer to this question is absolutely not. In fact, finding the bias in a primary source can often make it more useful and valuable as a historical artifact because it can tell you a lot about the views of the person who created it, and it can give you insight into what this source tells you about the topic you are researching. It can tell you who they were writing for or who they were intending this source to be read by. It can tell you something about why an event happened the way it did. So bias is actually something that we really want to look for in primary sources. We want to try to figure out what the bias is. It doesn't mean that a source is unreliable. All right, so now that we're a bit more comfortable with what bias is, the next question we need to ask is, well, how do I determine or how do I find bias in my sources? Now, first you need to figure out the basic information about your source. What kind of a source is it? Is it a painting? Is it a speech? Is it a letter? Is it a diary? Who's the author? Who's the creator? What do I know about this person or group of people? When was it created? Who was it created for? What's the audience at the time that it was created? What's the purpose of the source? Is it a source intended to inform people or educate people? Is it advocating for a particular position? Is it a personal record? So these are kind of the basic questions that you want to be asking. And we talked last time about the different levels of questions that you want to ask about your primary sources. Once you have that basic information, you can then look at that information and you can figure out what the potential bias might be. For example, let's take a look at this famous painting of the Founding Fathers by the artist John Trumbull. Now, obviously, if we're looking, well, what kind of a source is this? It's a painting. And we know a little bit about this painting. If you just Google it or look it up, on Wikipedia, we know that it was commissioned by Congress to hang in the Capitol building. And we know that the painter, John Trumbull, was a painter who primarily painted scenes from American history. And we know that it was painted around 1819. So about 40 years or so after the Declaration of Independence. And we can imagine that perhaps at least some of the individuals depicted in this painting are still alive at the time that it was painted. And the spirit of the American Revolution is still pretty strong at this period in American culture. And since we know that it was commissioned to hang in the Capitol building, we can infer that the audience for this painting would have been members of Congress, government officials, any Americans who came to the Capitol building to visit it. So you'll want to think about if you were analyzing this as a primary source, you would want to think about what this tells us about the potential bias of the painter. Do you think he would be pro or anti-America? Is he pro or anti the Founding Fathers? We can also, now that we've established maybe a potential bias just by, reviewing the basic information that we know about the painting, we have to look at the source itself to try to figure out whether that potential bias is there. So when you're dealing with a painting or any kind of visual image, you need to look at how the artist draws or depicts the people in that image. So you would want to look at this picture and see, well, how is he depicting the Founding Fathers in this painting? Are they depicted in a derogatory way? Are they depicted in a celebratory way? How does this confirm or throw into question the potential bias that you might have uncovered? So that's kind of what you would want to look at if you had sort of a visual source. If you're dealing with a written source, it's a little bit different. You have to look at the language being used and the information being presented. And you want to look for times in a source where any of the following things happen. So when a source is describing people or events, is the language that they're using overly positive, with very little or no negative language? Or on the flip side of that, is the language overly negative, with very little or no positive language being used? Is this source failing to mention important information that you are aware of? Since we have kind of the benefit of historical hindsight, does this source, sort of fail to mention something? That's what I meant when I talked last time about the gaps or the silences in a document. Is the source providing clearly incorrect information? You can't always take primary sources at face value. They're not always going to provide information that is correct, especially if the source has a very strong agenda or a strong bias in it. And if you notice any of these things in your source, it indicates that the creator has a specific bias about the person or about the event that they're talking about, and they want to communicate that in a way that positions the audience to see things from that same perspective. So we can take this example here. This is an excerpt, a quote from Frederick Douglass's famous 1852 speech, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" So we want to look at where we see bias in the language used in this speech. Well, it's fairly obvious in a lot of ways. For example, let's look at the language he used. He says, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" And he answers that question. He says, "I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all the other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour." So he's definitely got a bias here, right? He's definitely very critical of Americans and American society. And he's trying to convince his audience to feel about America and American society the same way that he does. He's trying to convince them to, this is a speech designed to draw people to the abolitionist cause. Now, I chose this example for a reason, because Frederick Douglass's opinion is likely one that many of us might agree with today, knowing what we know about how terrible slavery was. And sometimes it can be tough to detect bias because we don't want to see it, because we agree with the position being taken by the author or the creator, and we don't want to think of ourselves as biased. So it's easier to say, oh, well, this source isn't biased. But we have to remember there's always a bias, even if you agree with it. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So hopefully this has kind of been helpful for you guys in understanding how to think about bias, how to approach it, and hopefully you'll be able to, sort of understand a little bit more about how you want to look at primary sources when you are thinking about this question of bias. So if you guys have any questions, please do get in touch with me, and I look forward to talking with you soon.